Motherhood, but not quite as we imagine. Thought-provoking, refreshing, straightforward, sometimes taboo, often seemingly ordinary, but always honest. Welcome to School for Mothers, opening conversations we all need to have, exploring ways in which you can be fulfilled as a woman, once a mother. Now here is your host, mother of 10, Danusha Melina Durban.
Hello and welcome back to episode 30 of the School for Mothers podcast. I'm Danusha Melina Durban, your host, and the title for this week's episode is Lies. And my special guest is Christine Armstrong. Christine's the author of The Mother of All Jobs, How to Have Children and a Career and Stay Sane-ish. She's also contributing editor of Management Today and co-founder of communication and change consultancy, Jericho Chambers. Not only that, she's also on the PTA, in spite of her own advice on the subject. The Sunday Times wrote a really excellent piece on Christine that truly sums up exactly what Christine's work is about and why she just had to be on this podcast. They wrote, glossy portrayals of super organised working mothers do not reflect Christine Armstrong's experience, nor that of other mothers she meets. Families are damaged by these big little lies, she argues. I think you can all see why this episode is entitled Lies. To be honest, it's perfect timing to have Christine on the show today. Episode 29, Proof, with Caroline Flanagan, got us thinking about the have it all debate, and it's great to be able to move on to work-life balance and all the bullshit that surrounds this topic. I won't keep you waiting any longer. Let's dive into my conversation with Christine Armstrong. There are those days when we meet a kindred spirit. And when I met Christine, I felt very much like that. We were at a conference last year in an almighty queue. And I found myself beside this really beautifully dressed, stunning woman. And we got chatting about this queue and about the day. And I was incredibly lucky to find that she was one of the keynote speakers. And so since then, I've absolutely, gorged on her work. I love your work, Christine. And so today, I'm really thrilled to be welcoming Christine Armstrong to talk about lies, which I think is fascinating. So welcome, Christine.
Well, thanks for having me. It was lovely to meet you as well.
Wasn't that a massive queue?
Oh, God. Yeah, it was awful. It was the worst organised conference I've ever been to.
We won't say which one because it's actually the actual content of it was great, but the organisation, yes, left a lot to be desired.
Pretty dodgy,
Yeah, it was. But what a fortuitous meeting because, of course, would never have met you unless it had have been such a shabby affair in that sense. So thank you very much for our conversation and the ones that we've had since and today. So lies now. Where should we start with lies? And I know you've got an amazing book that unearths quite a lot of lies and more, of course. So where should we start?
Well, for me, the lies started with when I first was trying to work full time with one and then two small children, I was finding it incredibly difficult and I was looking for the answers, basically. I was really, really struggling. I was really tired. I was really frustrated at work. I was really stressed. I felt very disconnected from my kids and from my partner and from my home. And really, I sort of look back on it and it's quite a dark phase of my life. And, a time that people think should be quite special and treasured was really, really very oppressive. And so I thought I would go and interview people who had big jobs and small children. And we called them the power mums. And I convinced the editor of Management Today to let me go and talk to them. And the conversations were a total ruse in that I'm not a journalist by training, although I write a lot now. But I had written for Management Today, I'd done a blog for them before. It was really that I needed someone to tell me the answers, and the interviews were kind of an excuse to get people to do it, basically. So
isn't that a great way to do it?
I was calling all these really, successful, important people with kids and going, "Hi, can I come and talk to you?" And they were very generous with their time, and I would go and talk to them, and they would be full of advice and wisdom and thoughtful and very lovely. But in many cases, and not all, but in many cases, I would talk to them afterwards at some social event. Maybe they would invite me for lunch. And a really different story would emerge from what they could say on the record. And what I came to understand is that if you're in a job and you've got a family and you're finding it quite hard, it's really difficult to talk about that beyond a very, very small group of people who are your close family and friends. And the reason is that obviously your employees will read it, your boss will read it, your team will read it. If you're in a senior role, which many of the people who comment on these kind of issues are, then your shareholders will read it. You know, the people who might promote you to your next job, headhunters, whoever. And so it made me realize that we have this very untrue narrative about working parenting in this country at the moment, which is that if you work really hard and you're really ambitious and dedicated, it's absolutely fine. And the reality is more complicated than that.
Isn't it just? Yes. So there's kind of a dual narrative going on, or actually multiple narratives, isn't there? So these women...
The dominant media narrative is the one that if you work really hard, it'll be fine. There is an underlying social media and friendship group narrative, which is like, my God, this is so hard. But that hasn't. Until the Sunday Times piece that I wrote last year, it's so many people. I got 1,000 messages when my book came out, and the piece was called Big Little Lies. I got 1,000 messages in 24 hours from people saying, oh my God, why is this the first time anyone said this publicly that I can read? Like, I thought it was just me. And so I'm really concerned that this dominant media narrative by very, very successful women, which is well-intentioned, I'm not in any way having a go, is actually making lots of people feel like they're failing.
Yeah, it is. I've been on stages with several women who have told that perfect image narrative of, yes, it's very possible. It's actually just get this and this in place. And then of course you can be VP of this, COO of that, and, on the board of this, and come off the stage and said quite the opposite.
Exactly.
The actual opposite in the green room or, in whatever cupboard we're put, to get our kit together, like, oh God, my husband and I, we hate each other. Literally, where they almost, having had that public, performance, then they need to vent it somewhere. And to tell the truth, I mean, they probably do it also because I don't do that. I say much more of, I don't stand and say, yay, it's all incredibly easy. No, quite the opposite. So of course I do trigger that in people and invite them by who I am to tell more truth about it. But it's so sad that women who've, worked so hard to get to where they are, I can only assume, and actually some have told me, it's too dangerous. It's just too dangerous and too vulnerable to stand up and say, here's what it's really like. No, it's not true that if you work hard, you can make all this work, because actually the structures aren't there for that to happen. So yeah, I'm sad about that. It is sad that we've got this, but it has to change.
I think it's sad because it's dishonest and because it makes other people feel like they're not trying hard enough, or it's some fault in them or their family that they can't make it work and thrive. I think it's sad that we have such a cap on the narrative. I was talking to some law firm partners, and one of them said, if we said what we really thought, we would never work again in law.
Yes, exactly. Well, that's it.
About the hours and the demands and the always on. And the way that I see it is that we've changed the way that we work in the last 20 years. And you like I will remember when email was installed on your computer, the excitement when you were first given a BlackBerry, and that seemed like a real step forward somehow, because it meant you were important enough to have one. And then the BlackBerry being combined with your mobile phone, and then this gentle expanding of the working day. People commute a bit further because house prices have quadrupled. People live a bit further away from their original families. And we've moved from an assumption that we'll have one parent or one member of the family out at work, the breadwinner, which is usually dad, 9 till 5 or whatever, to this idea that both parents, if there are two parents in a household, will be out earning money to pay the rent or the mortgage. And we haven't figured out where the caring goes in that. We haven't figured out who's supposed to take care of our kids or our parents or whatever else we have to deal with in that. And we're all trying to work it out, right? Employers are trying to work it out. Is flexible working the answer? What else can we do? And every family in the country that's up against this is going, okay, what can we do differently? How can we make this work? And for me, we have to be really honest about the fact that you can't work a 14, 15, 16-hour day and care for a family and feel perfectly calm and happy. It just doesn't work out. So, everybody's got to make their own decisions about this. And unless we have that conversation, then I think we're profoundly disempowering people.
How are you doing it?
Well, I've changed the way that I work completely because of my interviews. So essentially, I've spent the last 7 years interviewing not just mums, dads, but also teachers and business leaders and managers and, HR departments and, anyone really, nannies and social workers and au pairs, anybody that kind of has a view on the system. And what I've taken away is that people who are able to take control of their time seem to be much, much happier, even if they're still working long hours. If they're choosing when those hours are, if they're choosing what those hours are, then they seem to be much more stable and much happier. And so that's really how I designed my life. So 5 years ago, about the time we had our third baby, I stepped out of sort of formal corporate work and co-founded a consultancy which had no fixed hours and no fixed holidays, where essentially you get paid for the work that you do. And that worked really, really well actually with small children, because it allowed me to be a professional, to use my professional skills and to be in the world. And so to, do what I'd done for the last 15 years before I'd had kids, but also to be able to be home when I needed to be. And that worked really well. And then when the book came out, it's just been so overwhelming that I've really focused a lot of time on writing and speaking and doing things like this. So I've changed again. But again, I'm very much in control of my time, and nobody tells me that I have to go to compliance training from 8 until 12, meaning that I've got to work until 10 o'clock tonight to do my day job. All those things, those small but important things that drive people completely crackers.
Yes, which is why so many women are leaving corporate roles in droves, isn't it? To have control.
It is. It really is. And I interview so many women who say, Christine, I am a very, confident, I'm very skilled, I really enjoy my job, and I've spent 10 or 15 years or whatever invested in it. I want to do it, but I just want to be able to do it from 9 until 5 and then go home. And why is that not possible? And somehow we've defined, I am talking about professional jobs here, but we've defined a professional working world where that is seen genuinely in many businesses as part-time.
Yeah, of course.
I interviewed one woman who said to me, my biggest problem, Christine, she's really intense about it, is that after school clubs finish at 6 o'clock. And I said, how old is your child? And she said 7. I'm like, really? This is where we've got to, where we see the answers not as to change work, but that our 7-year-old should be in club for how many hours a day? How many hours do we want these kids to be cared for by the school or carers or people around them? And I don't blame her for that. I'm not making a judgment, because I've been her. I've been in that world where leaving at 6 just feels completely like you're letting the side down and letting the team down. So it isn't a judgment on her, it's a judgment on how we're working. And it's really frustrating when you also look at the data. There's some great data from the States which shows that in an average working day, people are productive for less than 3 hours. I think it comes out as 2 hours 54 we actually spend doing work. And the rest of the time we are, it counts. It does this hilarious breakdown of what we do for the rest of the time. Over an hour reading online newspapers, 27 minutes on average looking for another job, 20 minutes making tea and coffee. It's this ridiculous catalogue of things that we're all doing that aren't actually moving the business forward. And you look at the UK's productivity failures, and you kind of go, we're working all these blinking hours and we're not achieving very much. And yet, I've got somebody on Twitter this morning that I've been corresponding with called Ambitious Mother. I haven't actually met her. And she's saying, she's got a very high-powered job and she does it 4 days a week, and she's trying to change roles. And her new boss is saying, well, how can you possibly do the job 4 days a week? To which her response is, well, don't worry, I'll work the 5th day. I'm always contactable. And well, how is this the answer? What are they looking for her? Why can't she just do her job? She's clearly very competent. Why do they need to control her every hour of every day? So there's something very unhealthy in this dynamic. And for me, the important thing to start with is to talk about it and be honest about it.
Yeah. Well, the groundswell of people that obviously privately are feeling this is there. But how do you break the silence? Clearly you have. I get that you have. you're breaking it through the book and you're breaking it through your speaking and bring it. But and it's one mode, but how do women who are occupying roles in companies where, this would be counter-current, it would be heinous, actually, it would be suicide, career suicide. How do you do that? So we'll have listeners here, actually thinking, oh God, if only I could do that. Now, Christine, tell me how.
Yeah. I mean, the truth is that it is very, very hard for an individual person or individual family to try and fix this single-handedly. There are decisions that you can make about your life and how you organise it and the boundaries that you put around work that may make it work for you better at different phases. And we can talk about them. But to wholeheartedly change it, we have to have businesses realise that the data is a bit hard to get on this, but, say 43% of very highly professional trained women leaving the workforce after they have kids means that we're not experiencing a talent shortage, as we're often told. We're simply wasting huge rafts of talent, which are unable to be able to combine caring roles with a professional job. And that's just insane. Not only that, but we've got businesses. And there's been some really interesting research from some of the banks in the last few weeks about how unsatisfied a lot of female consumers are. So particularly in financial services, women are really frustrated. They don't feel their needs are met. They don't feel financial advisors listen to them or care about them. So not only are we losing talent, we've also got businesses that are leaving money on the table, that are not expanding, that are not looking at their customers in a way that is appropriate, given that 45% of the world's wealth is Northern Europe and America's wealth is now controlled by women, that are actually, fundamentally at odds with the society that we live in, but are very slow to change. And so a lot of, I get called by a lot of HR departments, a lot of diversity inclusion people to come and talk to them about these issues. And one of the frustrating things that I see is I very often go into business and say, well, what have you done, about this issue? You've lost all these women. Quite often their board has got, close to the 30% because they're under so much public pressure for that. But they will openly admit that the 3 layers below that are almost entirely male dominated. And there's a very, very weak female pipeline coming through that. And they will then tell me quite often that they've set up a women's network, that they've offered some coaching and mentoring for women. They might have tried a bit of blind recruitment, but probably not. They might have tried a bit of flexible work, but not with any great commitment. And frankly, there's a number of managers that won't accept it anyway. And so they've sort of tried these things that they're poking around the edges of, and then they're frustrated those things aren't working. And when I say, well, do you ever talk to the men in the business about this? They generally haven't, and they don't really know how to. And when I interview women in the business, when I go in and talk to them and say, well, what's your experience of being in this business? They'll say things like, well, we have quite a good flexible working policy on paper, but my boss would never allow anyone to take it. And if you do take it, makes it perfectly clear you'll be the first one out when he does cuts, or you'll never get promoted, you'll never get a pay rise. So the lived experience in these businesses is very different, even if they've got good policies. And so what I think is really important is to have a really, really different conversation about this. And it has to involve a conversation with men. Because if male managers sort of are afraid of this subject, if they feel disadvantaged, which many do, if they feel excluded, if they feel, God, we only ever say the wrong thing, and the women get all the coaching and support and they get to go to nice women's group events and hear interesting speakers and we just do the work, what are we, the morons around here? Unless we open up that conversation, I don't think that we're ever going to make real progress.
Which companies are actually having these conversations though, Christine? With men? Are there any?
Do you know what? On a whole scale basis, I don't know. As you say that, I'm racking my brains. Lots of them want to. It's really interesting. I had a conversation quite recently with a high street bank and they were like, we really, really want to have this conversation. Could you sort of think about different ways we might do it? And then came back sort of very informally and a bit sheepishly and said, this is great. We really want to do it. But the men really don't want to talk about this stuff.
I know, exactly. So School for Mothers does a lot of consulting around this subject. And so we have a lot of crossover, as you know, and thank God there's a few of us, doing this work, quite a few of us. And actually, as you were speaking, my experience of this is that the men don't want to come. They don't want to come to the conversation yet.
Well, I think the way to do it, because I interview men one-on-one quite often and they're very frank and very open. So I think the way to do it and for men to feel safe is to have the conversations one-on-one and then bring it back into workshops. So bring it back and say, let me tell you an account of the same event from 2 different perspectives.
Yes.
And it's not necessarily, you make it generic enough that you're not singling out anybody who might or might not have handled something perfectly. But you're just saying, in this scenario, how did it feel? Do you recognize this? How did you feel? How did the other person feel? What were you trying to achieve? And to try and elevate some of these things into conversations that are in the open. So rather than in private, in the canteen, in the loo, in whispers, there's things that we can actually talk about in the business. And there are businesses trying to do this and taking it really seriously. And the businesses, I think, that are most likely to take it seriously are those businesses that know that they've got a huge female consumer base and that they have to have senior women. Otherwise, they would really, really be missing their own market.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, I mean, they have to, as you say. Otherwise, they'll leave that money on the table as they are. So it's a funny old problem, isn't it? I talk with men, consult with men individually and in teams, and we do talk about this. And actually, they are equally yearning for something different. Not all men, of course they're not. I'm not blanketing this, but they're really frustrated because actually men's roles have changed dramatically. So this presenteeism, these enormous hours, the demands, the pressures on men, it's hurting them. They want to be fathers, decent fathers, whatever that means, good fathers, present fathers, loving fathers, involved fathers, engaged. And they do.
They do, but they find it very hard. Those men that feel that way find it very hard to say it publicly because they think the stigma and the judgment on them is much harder than on women who say that. So, I do think this is part of a very significant generational shift where you've got a group of CEOs and leaders who are largely male, who have grown up in the breadwinner model, who have got partners who've been based at home and raised the children, who really are quite happy to work 12 or 14 hours a day on the whole, who feel well rewarded for that, who feel they've got recognition and authority and are quite comfortable with that. And then you've got another generation of men who are looking at their household income and the price of housing and saying, there is no way that I alone could do this. And anyway, I don't want to. And my partner doesn't want to be at home because, social norms have changed and she's very successful and ambitious and wants to do things. So it has to be a much more mixed pattern and it has to be more balanced between us so that we both have the opportunity to work and earn money and also be engaged with that family. But those men who feel that way feel very silenced at the moment and very afraid of speaking out. And so part of, I think, what, the job of having conversations with men is to liberate that conversation and make sure that those men aren't belittled for saying something. It was really interesting. I was doing a presentation at a big business about 2 weeks ago, and the chief executive introduced me. And he said, I really don't see gender differences. And I've always been really committed to raising my kids. And I've always dropped them at school in the morning before I come to work. And afterwards, one of the women in the room came up to me and said, it's all very well for him to say he drops his kids, but he lives in the centre of London. And I live in zone 5. So if I drop my kids at work, I would be here at about 5 to 10. He can drop his kids at a very, very expensive private school, and he can be here at 8:30. So, this generational misunderstanding, of course, nobody said that directly to him, was pretty profound. And she was quite frustrated. She sort of eyes filled with tears. I would love to drop my kids at school every day, but I wouldn't have my job if I did.
Yeah, but isn't it a pity that nobody has re-educated him and actually, not challenged, because that's his lived experience. That's fine. That fits his, his ability to do what he does because of his role. But the fact is, nobody's actually said to him. I mean, I'm slightly aghast.
He's choosing not to be challenged because he introduced me and then he went to another meeting. So he did not see dealing with this issue as a priority and he left. And so this whole enormous conversation then happened without him in the room. And when I'd finished presenting and talking, outside the glass hall, outside there were lots of groups of people who stood in the corridor for ages continuing this conversation. So it was a real shame that he'd missed it, but that's very common. I mean, I'm sure you have the same experience. If I had £1 for every single time I get invited to speak to the Women's Network, I could make myself incredibly rich without ever having to go and speak to the Women's Network. But the truth is that speaking to the Women's Network won't solve it because the women in that group already bloody know the answers and they could sort it out by tea time, but they don't have the power or the authority to do so. And so that's why the conversation has to be happening in different places. And it cannot feel like we're attacking either gender or either generation. It just has to be a better understanding of how society has changed in a very, very short period of time.
Yes, absolutely. I think we've moved from that breadwinner model into a bread sharing model that brings profound changes to our expectations. And actually, you've talked about childcare and after school club and I'm, oh goodness, that poor little 7-year-old. And I understand her, by the way, like you, I'm not criticizing that mother. I've been her too. So, and that's why I'm sad because I just, it's these awful choice points that we have to make in order to do what we feel we have to do to keep our families going financially in all sorts of ways. But you did come back from childcare. You mentioned about there are some individual strategies. We've looked at the kind of organizational piece, but how about, and that's a huge deal. That's a tide that's going to come in. It's happening. There are enough of us that are determined to bring these conversations to bear in organizations. But what about individual women? Because as you said, each family is dealing with this differently.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is I try not to make it about individual women. I'd look at the whole family structure if you possibly can. I know there's single moms who might be saying, well, it is just me, which is fair enough. Then that's probably what you're looking at. But it's kind of looking at your household unit and going, right, what does it take for this unit to operate? Which isn't about one particular child. If there are multiple siblings, it's not about one parent or the other. If there are two, or, if there's a grandparent or somebody else, a pair, whatever, living in the house, how does the whole thing work together? And for me, the happiest families that I interview, the most stable, and I'm not saying they're not stressed and life's perfect, but the ones that seem to have it under control are the ones that see the whole household as one and then make very active decisions. And they are decisions that change as the children get older, as they go to different schools, and they reflect different points in their career. And the most unhappy and frustrated families are those who see it in a much more individual prism of, I want to achieve this, or he wants to achieve that, or this child needs this school and that child needs that school, and the third child needs a completely different school, which is a 5-mile drive down the road to meet their needs. And it's very fixed and nothing can change. And they're the ones I think that get very, very stressed. So with families that kind of want to say, okay, how do I make this work for us? I kind of go, right, how much time can you cope with working and how much time do your children need? And what does that look like? If both of you could perhaps do a 4-day week, if you could finish at 4 every day, if you could do a 9-day fortnight, if you could work at home every other week, or if you're very happy to work full time, but you've got great support, that also is fine. But being really honest about what allows you to be able to work and flourish, but also that sets aside some time for the parents to be okay, whether there's one or two of them. So if you need to go and do a Pilates class or go for a run or go swimming or, heaven forbid, go and get tipsy with your mates on a Friday night to feel better, then you need to build that in as well. Because otherwise, you can feel like you're holding on with your fingertips and you've got no adult time and no adult company. And certainly in the early years, I think everybody does feel like that. I know there'll be mums of small kids going, I've been out of the house for 6 months and not like to in the next 6 months. And I get that. But as the children get older, you need to sort of start establishing things that keep you sane. I call them little islands of sanity, the things in the week that you kind of go, okay, if I do that, then I kind of feel a bit better about life. But all of that is about really clear-sighted decision making, which is the easy bit, and then it's about doing it. And that's the much harder bit. So I always say it's a bit like a diet, on Monday morning, and you're like, right, I'm only eating cod and soup. Only cod and soup. That seems fine, right? And then Tuesday you're like, maybe just a digestive, and Wednesday you're like, oh, I really need beer. Can somebody give me a beer? And you just like the whole thing's full of it's very much the same with this. It's kind of, I will leave at 4 or 5, whatever the time I've agreed, and I've taken, I've negotiated hard for this. And the first day you're up and you're out and you're like, brilliant. And the second day you're just heading for the door and someone comes over and says, oh, you couldn't just help me with this. And the third day, and you're 5 minutes late. And the third day, there's a huge crisis, and you're there until 9 o'clock at night. It's the doing it that's really, really, really difficult. But it's important, and it's important to role model it, and it's important to try and do it. And every time, it's the same as a diet. Every time you fall off, get back on the horse again and try it again. And to be really reflective, to give yourself time at the end of the week to think, right, did that work out? Was that pretty good? Was that okay? Or am I completely and utterly broken and, unable to cope with the weekend? In which case, maybe next week I'm going to have to think about it slightly differently.
Yeah.
I'm not making it sound easy. It's not easy.
Well, you're telling the truth. That's why this is called lies.
That's really depressing. I'm like, I know, but I could tell you it's all fine. You just work harder and get a bigger whiteboard, but it won't work.
Exactly. No, it won't work. No, there's some fundamental changes that need to happen in family units. And I love that you really draw our attention to household units, because I know listeners will know in a variety of episodes, I talk about the fact that, different people ask me this. That's why I talk about it. I see us as a business unit. So I am a single mother, but I see our family and always have as a business unit. When I say business unit, I see it like a team. There's no one individual that is more important. We have to all pull together and actually, what does the whole unit need to work? And we have family meetings. They're quite famous in our family as Sunday afternoon, and we all bring it's fun. It sounds a bit much, but it's actually, we bring what we need as and when we need those meetings. And really that's our kind of course correction for, is this working? What needs to be tweaked? Who needs what now? Because of course the beauty of children and the challenge of all of us is we change, we're growing, our needs change. And so, this unit idea is so much better. But and I have friends who, there is a competition between, it's basically a competition between either who is most tired or whose job is most important, or who earns the most and therefore has more leverage, or, you're the woman, or, there are so many permutations of this, of basically divisions, and then resentment is enormous.
And I think having conversations about that, and I interview far too many women who said, I just didn't realise when we got together that his brain was wired to think I would be the one that organised all babysitters, that cut back on my job, that compromised on what I wanted to do, that his work events would always take priority over mine, that his work would always take priority over anything else that the family needed to do at the weekends and the evenings. And we never had that conversation. So I would say to anyone embarking on this, at least start by having those conversations. And I interviewed a gay couple in New York who adopted kids. And in order to adopt, they had to go through an adoption agency, and they had to do therapy and write essays and answer questions about how they were going to parent, and who would take off time when the kids were sick, and how they would pay for childcare, and how they would discipline their kids, and what they would do in different circumstances. And this guy I was talking to was just laughing and saying, our straight friends are tearing themselves apart as couples. Are fighting all the time, and we're just laughing because we resolved all of this. We've got it all written down in a file. And I think there's wisdom in that. I think it's, even if you didn't do it before, I think having those conversations as much as you can as you go is really valuable if you can have them.
Yeah, totally. And it's insane that we don't have them, really, that we assume, don't we, gaily assume that, well, of course we'll jointly do this. Of course we're invested in this in the same way. We just, women have to wise up on this, because our narrative is that it will be the woman, unfortunately.
Well, it's a social norm, and people replicate their own childhoods. My mother's first husband left her with 2 small children, and so she very much brought me up not to be any good at domestic work. She didn't want me to know how to clean or to take care of other people, because she didn't want me to be left in the caring role that she was, with small children and trapped and frustrated. And her line was, you always have to earn your own money so that you can support yourself and your children when some bastard leaves you. And
that's a happy little story.
Very positive. But actually, it served me and my sisters pretty well, I would say. We all have had careers, and we've all been financially able to support ourselves and any children that have come along. And touch wood, none of our husbands have actually left us. But having the wherewithal to be able to support your family is incredibly important, I think.
It is.
To think about that for your children.
It is. It's vital. Of course it is. And particularly in our times where, so many people's marriages or partnerships do dissolve. Of course they do. And then the woman often, mostly, has the children, and that has huge ramifications for her ability to work and ability to, therefore earn money and keep everyone afloat. Sadly, so many men don't pay maintenance. Many do, but there's a good old proportion that don't. So it's vital that we have our daughters and young women think about this well before you're in a relationship. So I know somebody who their relationship was fabulous until they had a child. And of course, the strains of having a child, we all know them very well. And then what was most surprising, I watched them do two things. One was that they called each other mummy and daddy. Ooh. So I clearly will not say their names because that wouldn't be right. But so they no longer had their Christian name. They were mummy and daddy. And they talked to each other as, well, mummy, would you like to do that? Would you like a glass of wine, mummy? Which I cringe at.
So if somebody said that to me, I think I'd want 3.
I'm going to just, yeah, exactly. Yes, you just pass me the bottle, daddy. But the more, also, that just really troubled me. But the actual thing that I really noticed was that mummy was responsible for all payment for the child. So daddy would give housekeeping money. I mean, talk about an archaic model. Daddy would give, and they were both working, by the way. Daddy would give mummy some housekeeping money, but the child, all childcare, all food, all clothes, any extracurricular things, anything, playgroups, anything, was mummy's responsibility. So basically, and being myself, I had to say, has it ever occurred to you that you're a single mother living with a man? Mm-hmm. I'm that kind of friendly friend. Yeah. After a couple of glasses of Prosecco, and actually I don't need the Prosecco to say that. I literally was, darling, what's going on here? One, why are you now mummy? And 2, what's going on with the money?
What's really interesting about that story, which is going to disturb you even more, is it's completely normal. So I know. I'm not sure about the mummy and daddy bit, but there are so many families. When I interview families and I say, how do you account for childcare costs? Who pays for childcare? It is almost always perceived to come out of the woman's income.
Yes.
And the problem with that, and the reason that we end up with so many women stepping out of work, is that, the Sunday Times had a piece of data, which never got them to substantiate, but saying that having 2 children in early years care before the 33 hours, you need a salary of £40,000 a year. But the average woman's salary in the UK is about £24,000, £25,000 a year. So we are pushing women out of work because they can't cover the childcare, because it is seen not as coming from the household income, but from the mother's income. And so, I've sort of used this quote quite often, but a woman said to me, I never thought that I was the kind of woman that could afford to be at home with her children when they were small. But what I've discovered is I'm the kind of woman that can't afford to work when my children are small.
Well, that's it, isn't it? That's totally normal. That's the thing. So that's why I actually said it to you. That's why I told you that story of her, because I know that's disturbingly normal. Whereas actually, if you take the household as a whole unit, how come the money isn't a whole unit? How come I have a uterus, I gave birth, therefore it is my job to care for this child? How come? What's that about?
It's our social conditioning, and does the mother work, or is it worth her working? So women say things like, do you know what, when I've worked full time for a month, they only take home 50 quid a month or whatever. And you've never heard a man say that, because they never do, right? Because that's not how they perceive their incomes, and it's not how we account for childcare. So there is something in the social construct of childcare. I mean, the biggest social political point I would make is that we have a generation of politicians who have grown up in this male breadwinner model, who have not experienced a dual income working family experience, and who don't get it either. And if we want to have a housing market and an economy that benefits from women working, and that, the OECD says that Nordic countries have benefited from 10 to 20% of GDP growth from having more women able to work in the ways that they want to, because by putting in a whole ranch of things to support working families, If we want that upside, then the government equally has to do its bit. And that is, we have the most expensive early years childcare in Europe. The 30 hours has so many problems. If you're not working, you can't access it. You can't access it to interview, to train. It keeps people out of the workplace. So, and who the heck works 30 hours a week for 38 weeks a year anyway? It's a completely weird construct when you step back from it.
Well, so, also... I was just going to mention that in the 30 hours, I mean, there's also money on top, isn't there? You've actually got to pay for things like lunches. You've got to, I mean, it's not free. It just isn't free.
Complicated, and the tax rebates, the vouchers. I interview people all the time. I don't understand any of this stuff. They don't have time. They're exhausted. And now they're expected to understand another flipping childcare provision system. And what we need is a very simple, subsidised early years support that means that people can work a decent week and also have childcare, but also feel that they are present as parents and that they can scale up and scale down. And the only party that I know who's talking about that is the Women's Equality Party.
Yes, exactly.
And it's really shocking to me that that's not really on the political agenda. Equally, the 9 till 3:15, 3:30 average school day. I mean, how does that match? I was told by somebody that during World War II, when we needed women to work in factories, they simply extended the school day so that women could pick the kids up after school. It was done in, by the way they described it, one afternoon they said, well, this is sensible, so we'll do it. We don't even talk about that. How could we design a day that means that people could do a sensible working day like they do in Denmark, say, and leave at 4 or 4:30, pick up their kids and have dinner and be productive when they're at work? And it's just astonishingly difficult for us to have this conversation, which is shocking, really. And bonkers.
I know it's bonkers. And touching on the education, I mean, just what kind of system is that? 9 to 3.
It's even worse in places like Italy, I've interviewed people there, and, the kids finish at 2. So, it is a real limit. And, I interview people as they come into the school years and they've been at nursery and they're paying an arm and a leg for nursery and they're going, oh my goodness, that'll be over soon and we'll be able to eat again. And then they go, oh my good Lord, how on earth do we go with a 9 till 3:15 day? Because at least with nursery, we could, cover most of a working day, albeit at vast expense. So, and this is one of my problems with a lot of the advice that comes, and the lies piece that I talk about is that, when people say, well, you just need to get really great childcare, that's one of the pieces of advice. You need to find a really great employer to support you. And there's 2 problems with that. One is that childcare isn't a fixed thing. You don't sort of at 6 months or 12 months go back to work and go tick childcare box. Right, that's done then for the next 18 years. It's changing day to day, week to week, as you know, moment to moment, as each child goes through each phase and each education or system or illness or whatever. It's a constantly moving feast, and it never stops as far as I can tell. I mean, obviously when your children leave home, but it's always there and it's always evolving, and I always feel slightly on the back foot with it. So that's one piece of it. And the other, find yourself a good employer. I mean, one of my sort of real kind of takeaways from the interviews that I do is it's nothing to do with having a great employer. You can have the most fabulous employer on paper, and if you've got a manager who's wholly unsupportive, it doesn't make any difference. You will still find it incredibly difficult. And when you go into a business, you might be lucky, or you might find a fabulous manager who's incredibly supportive and allows you to be really productive and do the day that you want to do and then leave and rewards you and is grateful for that. And then that manager gets promoted because they're clearly a great manager. And then you get somebody who calls the team meeting at 6:30 and runs it until 8 p.m. because that's when it suits them. And that's what's really, really hard for people.
Yes, you're actually at the mercy of those managers.
You are. And if those managers are largely men, which the payback data would suggest that they are, and we're not bothering to talk to them about these issues because we've got a women's group, then it's no surprise that we're not making a lot of progress. And if those men feel that their bosses expect them to be very present and expect them to be there at 10 o'clock, then of course they will replicate that behaviour in their own teams. Even if they personally are looking at their watch and getting texts from their wives saying, do you think you could be home for dinner one night this week? That would be great, love. They're still perpetuating the same banana system we're all trying to cope with.
What a depressing conversation.
I'm so sorry. Should we talk about something cheerful?
No, it's just like, oh.
And people say that to me, and I feel, I don't want to be the harbinger of gloom, but equally, I think it's much more uplifting to think, or at least it's not me and my family failing. It's the whole system has changed, and now we need to reconfigure the support around it. And if we're honest about the fact that it's changed and it's really difficult, then we can reconfigure it. If we keep going around Pollyanna going, it's all great, everything's fine, women are amazing, just work really hard, then we don't change it.
Well, exactly. So I was being stupid, I was just being silly saying it's depressing, because at one level, yes, of course, it's a bit of a depressing conversation, but you're absolutely right. We have to take it to this conversation because, that Pollyanna one is total dishonesty. It's not where things are, and we will never create change. And we have to create change. We really do. But what I absolutely adore is that it is not personal failure. It is not about individual women failing, not doing enough, not being enough of a mother or a worker or a whatever, or a wife. And it isn't. Every single one of us was straining, trying to find our solutions to an insane structural problem, and it has to change, as you said, politically. There are a lot of us doing what we can in our own ways to bring some change. And it's not going to happen overnight. But, your book is fundamental in this, in your interviews. And, who are you interviewing at the moment, by the way?
I'm doing tomorrow night. So one woman came up to me at an event that I was hosting and said, I really loved your book. It was so fantastic, but there weren't enough lesbians in it. And I said, I'm really sorry, because I hunted for lesbian mums, and I knew some and none of them wanted to talk.
Did you say you hunted them?
I did. I chased them around the playground for a couple of months. It's getting embarrassing. I was like their stalker. But I knew a couple of lesbian couples and none of them wanted to talk. And I contacted Stonewall, as I've got a friend who works there, and I was like, look, can you find me some more? And I had some sort of informal conversations, but no formal interviews. So this lady said, right, she said, I'm convening a group of lesbian mums for you. So I'm interviewing 10 lesbian mums tomorrow night about their experience, which I'm really looking forward to. And I'm really, really interested to see how their experiences of parenting differ from straight couples, and, what support that they want, and whether they feel heard and whether they feel recognised, and how it operates differently if you're a biological mum or a non-biological mum, and how that is.
Yes.
So I'm really excited about that.
Oh, that's going to be wonderful. That's amazing.
I'm really looking forward to it. And I'm also doing quite a lot of interviews with men at the moment. So I've got sort of quite on a beef about men and masculinity, and how we really get men talking about this, and get all of the positive support that men have for these issues, how we unlock that. Because there are so many men that want to change this just as much as women do, but somehow we don't hear from them. So, where does that go? And then the third thing that I'm doing is a piece on extreme hours. So I did a talk at a business, and shortly afterwards I got an email from one of the attendees saying, funny you should come in today, but straight after you left I got an email from a headhunter asking if I wanted to take a new job as a managing director of something. And I emailed back to the headhunter and I said, what would the hours be? And the response was, normal working day is 7 a.m. till 10 p.m. 5 days a week with a lot of travel. He sent me this whole email, like in the email. And I was like, wow.
Well, that's a winner, isn't it? 7 a.m. to 10 p.m.
5 days a week with a lot of travel. So this woman's got a child, And so I was just like, wowzers. So I'm quite also interested in how, in 2006, 2007, Sylvia Hewitt wrote about extreme jobs, and she talked about them being, these overwhelming hours, these 90-hour weeks, but then being incredibly well rewarded and incredibly recognised jobs. And I just wonder whether actually what's changed is that we have these incredibly overwhelming jobs, but they're not enormously well rewarded, and actually they're quite normal. And I was reading Adam Kay's book, I'm about 3 years too late, on This Is Going to Hurt, and looking at his hours as a junior doctor. So that's something else that I'm really interested in, is this extreme hours culture and where it exists. So I'm doing some work around that as well.
Oh, it's very exciting. I'm sure you're going to find so many people talking about their insane extreme hours. Of course you are. So tell me,
anyone listening and wants to tell me about being a lesbian mum or a gay dad or about their extreme hours, please do get in touch. I'm very interested in
that's wonderful. And the other is because I've been like you, I've chased lesbian mothers for some work in the podcast. And, it's interesting which groups of mothers are less visible, hidden. And one is disabled mothers. And I wondered, in your interviews, do you
I have interviewed some disabled mothers, but I've not made it a theme. And it's definitely something I would like to know more about and understand better, because I think you're right that it's another group that we don't hear enough from, and for whom, all of the problems which I describe are very insignificant when you are coping with your own disability and also, of course, the disability or the special needs of children.
Yes.
And that also is, can be incredibly challenging. So yes, very interested in those. I've also, done quite a lot on single mums, but I'll probably come back to that. And also single dads have their own issues, which is quite interesting.
Yes, they are.
So there's so much to explore that's interesting. You can, it's understanding it from different perspectives is really valuable.
It is. Thank you so much for this conversation, Christine.
I hope it's not too depressing.
No, it's not. It's bringing those lies to the surface and it's wonderful. And we have to do it. We have to. So I'm really grateful that you've been on the School for Mothers podcast and brought so much richness to this conversation. And thank God you're out there doing this work. Thank you.
Lovely to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you. Christine is a mega champion for working parents and so in touch with the realities of trying to balance work and life. Well, work within life. It was fabulous to get into the nitty-gritty behind this debate. Thanks so much to Christine for sharing her advice and tips. Be sure to buy her brilliant book. Hop on over to our website where there's a link to it there. It's a really superb book. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the episode. Do you agree with what was discussed? How do you find the realities of being a working mother, or indeed a working father? Let me know at podcast@schoolformothers.com. Now on Sunday, I'm going to be back with another Sunday supplement. They're beginning to be really popular. Sex toys went down a treat, really did. Anyhow, this time, the topic is family travel, and my guest is Karen Beddoe. Now, Karen and her family are the definition of globetrotters. Her love of travel led her to add in award-winning blog Mini Travellers on top of her career as a lawyer, board member and charity trustee. Karen's love of travelling with her family is totally infectious. I mean, that's why she just had to be on the School for Mothers Sunday supplements. You'll be scouring the internet for flights before the end of the episode, I bet. Anyway, and as if that isn't enough, on Wednesday, I'm joined by Debbie Gilbert, who's an entrepreneur, author, and founder of Mums Unlimited. Now, Debbie's episode is called Lift, and we'll be exploring the key place that collaboration plays in women's business success. I'll say this quietly. Being competitive with other women isn't ever the way forward. Listen in to get the lowdown on this from myself and Debbie Gilbert. I hope you'll join me on Sunday for the Sunday supplement on family travel, and after that with Debbie Gilbert. Till then, take very good care of yourself. Here's to you.
Thank you for tuning in to the School for Mothers podcast. To continue the conversation and keep your dose of inspiration up, head over to schoolformothers.com/podcast, where you'll find bonus content from Danusha and her guests on habits, recommendations, books, best apps, time-saving secrets, life hacks, health, sleep and anything in between. That's schoolformothers.com/podcast.